When people talk about The Amazing Spider-Man now, the conversation usually goes in two directions. Either Andrew Garfield was secretly a great Spider-Man, or the argument that Sony rebooted the franchise way too fast, and honestly, both things can be true. Because while Andrew Garfield brought a real emotional pulse to Peter Parker, at the same time, this movie came out only 5 years after Spider-Man 3 and only 10 years after Sam Raimi's first Spider-Man movies. So from the very beginning, The Amazing Spider-Man was fighting a battle that had almost nothing to do with the actual movie itself. The Amazing Spider-Man was not some forgotten disaster. It made over 758 million worldwide, which is a massive number for a reboot that a lot of people supposedly did not want, but culturally, it never felt like a complete win like the Raimi trilogy. It always felt like this strange middle child of Spider-Man movies. However, the older I get, the more I think that this movie is worth revisiting because The Amazing Spider-Man was released during one of the weirdest transitional moments in superhero movie history. With the Avengers on the horizon, superhero movies were starting to move away from these standalone director-driven stories and towards massive interconnected brands. However, right in the middle of that shift, Sony handed Spider-Man to Marc Webb, a director known for 500 Days of Summer, and asked him to relaunch a billion-dollar superhero franchise. So today I want to go back to that time period. I want to talk about what led to The Amazing Spider-Man and why the movie faced so much backlash and what was Marc Webb trying to accomplish with these movies. Looking back, The Amazing Spider-Man was never actually what people said it was. It wasn't just an unnecessary reboot, it was just a movie that came out at the wrong time. Now, to understand The Amazing Spider-Man, you have to start with the movie that never happened, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 4. After Spider-Man 3 came out in 2007, Sony was not finished with the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. Tobey Maguire was still the face of the character and Raimi was expected to return. A fourth movie was being developed and storyboards are out there even today. It seemed like a very obvious path forward. But Spider-Man 3 had already exposed tension between filmmaker and studio. Raimi wanted Sandman, Sony wanted Venom, and the final movie became very crowded and uneven. And even though Spider-Man 3 made a huge amount of money, the reaction was way messier than the first two films, especially compared to the near universal love for Spider-Man 2 that still stands today. So when Spider-Man 4 was starting to come together, there was a lot of pressure, and Raimi needed to redeem the series creatively, and Sony wanted another massive hit, and eventually the whole thing collapsed. And the studio would move forward with a new creative team focused on Peter Parker's teenage years, and Sony framed the decision as a return to Peter's roots, quote unquote, with Amy Pascal saying that the studio was excited by the creative possibilities of a new beginning. And that announcement is where the problem begins, because from Sony's perspective, rebooting made sense. Spider-Man was too valuable to leave sitting on a shelf, but from a fan perspective at the time, this felt abrupt. The Raimi trilogy had only ended a few years earlier, and in the public eyes, Tobey Maguire was still Spider-Man. Raimi's movies had helped define what was modern superhero cinema and what that even looked like. And by Sony suddenly saying, okay, forget that, here's another Peter Parker, it naturally created some resistance, and the resistance attached itself to Amazing Spider-Man before anybody even saw a frame of this movie. And that's why the early discourse surrounding this movie matters so much. A lot of viewers didn't walk into this theater waiting to see Marc Webb's interpretation of the character. A lot of people walked in asking, why does this exist? And to be fair, Sony invited that question by retelling the origin again. The movie was a reboot only 10 years after the first Spider-Man and 5 years after the most recent one. Was this too soon? In my opinion, probably. But was it pointless? I wouldn't say so. Because Marc Webb was not trying to recreate the Raimi movies shot for shot. He was trying to reframe Peter Parker through a different emotional lens. Sony hiring Marc Webb is still one of the most fascinating superhero decisions ever because today superhero movies usually go after indie directors, but by 2010 that move felt very strange. Webb had directed 500 Days of Summer, he's directed music videos and some smaller emotional material, and he wasn't known for massive action filmmaking. The hiring was a radical change, and especially after Sam Raimi's larger-than-life comic book approach, Webb himself has said that he wasn't trying to take over from Raimi. He saw the job as a chance to bring new ideas, history, and a creative voice to Spider-Man. And in an interview with Post magazine, Webb said that he wanted to make quote-unquote a character piece that evolved into a spectacular action adventure. But at the end of the day, I think that Marc Webb wanted to make a coming-of-age romance movie, and I know that might sound a little weird, but I really do believe that. The Peter and Gwen material is the soul of this entire era. Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone bring a kind of nervous, messy, spontaneous chemistry that superhero movies almost never capture with their on-screen love interests. And it's very obvious, they both were dating at the time, and that's exactly why those scenes work. Peter and Gwen do not feel like two characters being pushed together because a studio needed a love interest. They felt like two kids who were genuinely trying to figure out how to talk and how to love each other. And for example, the scene where Peter asks Gwen out is one of the best romantic scenes in any Spider-Man movie, not because the writing is so great, but it's just because Garfield and Stone play the awkwardness so honestly. And that kind of stuff is what is Marc Webb's wheelhouse. And that's where The Amazing Spider-Man, to me, separates itself a little bit from Raimi. It's more intimate, it's softer, and it's more internal. And you can see the 500 Days of Summer director in the way that Peter and Gwen's relationship breathes. You can feel him wanting to slow down and just watch two people exist in the same space before we even get to the Spider-Man stuff. And honestly, that's probably why the superhero plot sometimes feels weaker by comparison in these movies, because every time we see Kirk Connors and the Lizard take over the movie, you start to miss Peter and Gwen. And that's not because the Kirk Connor portrayal is bad, but the problem is that the movie never really makes Connors as emotionally vivid as Peter, Gwen, Uncle Ben, or Aunt May. So the villain plot just feels very functional. But one reason why The Amazing Spider-Man has aged so well in my eyes is because it has a real visual identity. You can pause this movie at any point and immediately know what Spider-Man era you're in. The Raimi movies, though, are very colorful, very theatrical, but the MCU movies are a little cleaner and brighter and more tied to the visual language of the MCU. Webb's first Spider-Man movie sits somewhere else. It has more shadow and texture and some great night photography. Now, with all that said, the backlash didn't come from nowhere. There were real problems with this movie, and the biggest one is repetition. No matter how well Marc Webb handles Peter emotionally, audiences had already seen the origin story, so even when certain scenes work, a feeling of deja vu and comparison hangs over this whole movie. The details change, but the skeleton is very familiar, and that's why the quote-unquote too soon criticism stuck. And then there's the whole Peter's parents mystery. The moving opening with Peter's parents leaving him behind is where the movie starts feeling less like a complete story and more like a franchise foundation, and audiences can feel that. Overall, I think that there is a great movie in The Amazing Spider-Man, and I think where it stands today is it's definitely more beloved than it was back then, and I think that Marc Webb's vision is more seen today by younger audiences like myself, but there is still some part of this movie that feels very formulaic and very studio driven, and I really would have loved to have seen what Marc Webb could have done with this movie and The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and a possible TASM 3 under just his vision. But unfortunately, we know that's not how it works all the time in Hollywood, so it's very unfortunate, but I still think that this movie ranks up there in the upper half, I would say, of Spider-Man movies. Is that a crazy take? I'm not sure, but I do love rewatching this movie. But let me know in the comments below, what do you guys think about this movie? Where do you think we stand on this thing 15 plus years later? I'd love to know down in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.